Mythical characters, I particularly am keen on the ones that are on the cusp of history. So people like Robin Hood or Joan of Arc. These are the people who are, certainly Joan of Arc was real. What she did is hidden a little bit in the mists of time. With Robin Hood, we're not quite sure whether he really existed or not. And there are many, of course, myths that come from Norse legends. Well, there's probably a little kernel, a little nut of truth there somewhere. And what I love is the fact that these stories have gone on being told. Let's just take Robin Hood, for instance. It's told in so many different ways these days. It's told in books, it's told on the stage, it's told in film. The problem is that people see film more. And so that becomes the story of Robin Hood, which everyone seems to believe is the real story. What my job as a writer is to go behind those stories, the way they've been redrafted for us today, and go back to the original story and find out, I'm afraid sometimes, the darker truth. Now with Robin Hood, if you go back to the 14th century, to when these little ancient poems were written down the first time, the end of Robin Hood, he is poisoned to death by an abbess. He's leeched to death by an abbess in a monastery. And only Little John is there. And he's on his deathbed and he knows he's dying. And Robin Hood says to Little John, "Give me my bow. I want to fire my last arrow through that window, and where it lands, there you must bury me." And so that's what he does, and he dies, and he's buried. And an oak tree grows over his grave. Well, that's the story that's there. And it's a really sad ending, and it's a murder, finally, at the end of this story. Well, you know what's happened to Robin Hood. These days what happens is that it all ends happily ever after. There's a lovely wedding in a forest with Maid Marian, and Sean Connery comes riding in as Richard the Lionheart, and everything is tickety-boo. And you think, fine, but which is the ending I would rather have, you know? Go to the ending which is the oldest, which is the closest, if you like, to the kind of stories they were telling found around their fires 700, 800, 900,000 years ago. And you're much more likely to get to the possible truth of a legend. And it's seeking the truth of a legend. That's the way I think that it can go on, because they're amazing stories. You can't invent them.